there. That's where we were supposed to be. I have a message, just so happens. Well, we talked a little bit about covenants in last week's Torah reading, and there's not much mentioned in today's Torah reading, but I wanted to get the details of the covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham and cover some of that for you, okay? Yahweh, open our eyes, please, that we might see wonders from your word, that we would be filled with your word. In Yeshua's name, amen. In Genesis chapters 12, 15, and 17 discusses Yahweh's covenant with Abraham. He makes a specific kind of a covenant. It's very important to us about that covenant. So let's kind of talk about this. In Genesis 12, Yahweh says, he promises to Abraham, and I shall make you a great nation. In chapter 17, verse 2, he says, and I give my covenant between me and you, and shall greatly increase you. In Genesis 17:4, he says, as for me, look, my covenant is with you, and you shall become a father of many nations. So let's make sure there's no confusion about who the covenant is really with. In Genesis 17:21, Yahweh says, but my covenant I establish with Yitzhak, with Isaac. Now the ratification of the covenant with Abraham is by blood. This is what I'm going to talk about, blood. Genesis 15, 8 through 10 is the specific discussion of that blood covenant. The covenant sign is by blood also, and that's circumcision, which is in Genesis 17, verses 9 through 10. The blood covenant with Abraham, the one that's discussed in Genesis 15, 8 through 10, the blood covenant is also referred to as the covenant of promise. So when you see that text in the New Testament, covenant of promise, it's that blood covenant. It is not a universal covenant. It does not encompass everybody on the planet. That was done with Noah, so he wouldn't bring a flood again. That covenant was with everybody. This one is with Abraham and his seed only. It was made to one man and his descendants, and the word used is seed, singular, and the Hebrew for that is zerah. Those that are outside of Abraham's seed, his zerah, are not included. There is a provision for those that want to join the covenant, but they're not automatically included, simply, strictly with Abraham. Now, there is a limited number of descendants, even, this seems silly, but even though that number is countless, theoretically, you could look up and count the stars in the sky. It'd take a while, but there's a number. All other covenants with the people of Israel, Abraham's seed, singular, are based on that covenant. The new covenant, the New Testament, is based on the covenant with Abraham. It's not a separate thing. It is the same covenant with Abraham. There's just some modifications to it. Yahweh sees, now you write this point down. This is serious. Yahweh sees Israel through the blood of the covenant relationship. He doesn't look at Israel any other way. He looks at the rest of the world through other than the blood covenant that he made with Abraham. But Israel, strictly through the blood covenant relationship. Okay, let's talk about that covenant. In Genesis 15:8, Abraham, now if you go before this, the text talks about Abraham being promised a bunch of stuff. And Abraham says to Yahweh, now this is not questioning him that he will do it or anything. He just really is asking a point-blank question. How do I know that I possess all this? The covenant is, he's giving him the land and then a bunch of kids. So how do I know that I possess this? The very next verse looks like this. And he, Yahweh, said to him, bring me some animals. And he specifies a 3-year-old heifer, so that's a cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And then he doesn't say anything else about it. He just says, bring me this stuff. The very next verse, and he, Abraham, took all of those and cut them in the middle and placed each half opposite the other, but he didn't cut the birds up. And he let them bleed, and they formed this big pool of blood. That's it. That's the entire discussion. Yahweh did not tell him to do this, but he knew that Yahweh was telling him, we are going to make a blood covenant between you and me. And in the ANE, you know what the ANE is? The ancient Near East. In that part of the world during that time, there were things that were common, culturally common. And Abraham sees this as one of those culturally common things. He's going to make a blood covenant. And it is so serious to the people of that day. And we don't have the full, we don't get it. Abraham completely understood that Yahweh intended to make this blood covenant with him. The reality must have hit him like a truck. It must have been something. Now I want to go back just a second. And he cut the animals in the middle. Now we always are looking at pictures and they cut the animal head to tail, okay? You know? Have you thought that out? With a knife, cutting it head to tail. Okay, the text, and I did a little research on this, it just said cut, as in with a knife, in the middle, as in the middle. So he could have cut him at the waist. Of course, do they have waist? Is it horizontal or is it vertical? Okay, he just cut them in half. And they bled terribly all over the place in a pool. 3 pretty good sized animals, although they're 3-year-old animals, that's a lot of blood. That's a big pool of blood. And then the rest of the story here in Genesis 15 talks about a whole lot of birds and stuff coming around. I bet there was a lot of excitement in that particular area. Okay. The thing we're talking about is a suzerain or suzerainty type covenant. This was a thing done in the ANE. It is a treaty type covenant. This is dictionary definition. in which a lesser state or group of people and a greater state or group of people form a relationship called the suzerain covenant or the suzerain treaty. The suzerain state is the big one, the king, okay, the greater state. And it enters into what is called this covenant with a vassal state, okay? Vassal state would be a smaller town or a smaller group of people. They are dependent on the larger group, the king. Yahweh is the great king. He enters into this suzerainty covenant with Israel through Abraham. Now, he's actually entering it with Abraham and his seed. It's not just that one guy. It's his entire seed forever, which brings it to you. Israel is Yahweh's vassal people, V-A-S-S-A-L. Look it up. Okay, it has to do with kings and princes and stuff that like that. Look it up. The suzerainty covenant benefits both parties. It's not the king lording over all of the vassal states. Everybody benefits from this. When a covenant is established, both parties are supposed to be faithful to the covenant, the terms of the covenant. In the A&E, that was serious stuff. Nowadays, you wonder what's going on. I don't want to go there. Never mind. The covenant is never forced on the vassal state. You understand? It's all volunteer work. The covenant between Yahweh and Israel benefited both parties, and in all biblical covenant, it is assumed that Yahweh and man would be faithful to the covenant. Covenant features. Now, there's a whole lot more to it than this. Actually, there's several pages to it. Anyway, one of the prime feature of the covenant is love. I'm using the term, the Hebrew word ahava. And ahava is the technical word for love. The word ahava is used to speak of Yahweh's love for Israel, Israel's love for Yahweh. You can write this in stone. Yahweh, love, ahava, a true love, is man's proper response to Yahweh's demonstrated love to us. We love him back because he first loved us. Any of that text making sense? Okay. The covenantal love is always expressed outwardly with deeds or works that are beneficial to the relationship. Covenantal love is not a nebulous emotion of good feelings. It is, you do stuff. Yeshua teaches about this covenantal love. He says, if you love me, and that's going to be a covenantal love, you will keep my commandments. Which ones? All of them. And as we've talked here before, he wrote it. He gave us the commandments, so we keep all of them. The covenantal relationship Israel has with Yahweh is demonstrated in keeping his Torah, his law. Yahweh reiterates this in his statement, or Yeshua reiterates this in his statements. We are in a covenantal relationship with Yeshua, and he's going to seal that covenant by blood. Therefore, our love dominates the relationship. His for us for him. And the love is demonstrated in obedience to Yahweh's commandments, in obedience to Yeshua's commandments. Yeshua is the lawgiver. It's in James, if you needed to know where that was. Yeshua's death by his choice. Do you understand? The key phrase, by his choice, and his resurrection are outward expressions of Yahweh's love for his covenant people Israel. Okay? His death by his choice. He could have gotten out of it. He could have said, no, I don't want to do that. He could have also said, have you seen these people? Our love for Yahweh, our love for God in this covenant relationship is expressed by our faithfulness to obeying his commands and living his Torah in our everyday lives. One of those commands is the Sabbath command. It is obvious if you're sitting here on Sabbath or if you're resting on the Sabbath that you're obeying the Sabbath command. It's kind of like, it's obvious. Okay, Yahweh cuts a covenant with Abraham. This is how this thing worked. And I'm cutting this down. Wait a minute, that wasn't right. I am reducing the amount of words. A common practice in the A&E was to sacrifice an animal and cut its body in half. Two guys want to make a blood covenant with each other. So they get these animals and they cut them. Now this picture happens to show them head to tail, and I don't agree with that. All the blood runs together in a big pool. It's kind of nasty. And then the covenanting parties walk between the halves of the animals. Do you understand that? As they walk between the halves of the animals, they get blood all over the place. Now, they wore long roby things, okay, not trousers, and they got blood all over the place on their roby things, and they got it on their sandals and on their feet, and this stuff doesn't wash off real good, and it's going to smell real bad and draw flies. But they did this symbolizing the very grave consequences for somebody who failed to uphold the terms of the covenant. Basically, you're saying, if I fail to do what I've just promised to do, you can do this to me. It was life or death. Really. Now, here's something else they did. Food is important. After they did this, they may write this covenant down so that they don't forget it. That covenant became like a legal document. They get this thing, it's all done. Then someone is cooking this while they're going through all of that. After they've got the blood all over the place and they've written down the covenant and they've signed it or they put their whatever they've done, and they eat it. Maybe not just the two of them, but everybody else around them. They might have, the king and his court, and then the vassal state and his court or his witnesses, and everybody eats this meal. And this seals the thing. Now, I'm going to probably have to bring that up later on in something that Yeshua said about eating my body and drinking my blood. He certainly was not talking about physically eating his body and drinking his blood, because you can't do that. So there was some kind of symbolism there. We need to discuss that someday. In the covenant between Yahweh and Abraham. Okay, now try to visualize this. Turn on your brain and look at the picture. The blood is there. The animals are all laid out. Abraham falls into a deep sleep. Now, the reason for that is he could never keep the terms of that covenant. it is impossible for him or even his seed to keep the terms of that covenant. So Yahweh walks between the animals. It's Yahweh who got the blood on his sandals and on his robe. And he walks through, symbolized by the smoking furnace and the torch, the burning torch. He said, "This is so serious to me that I'm even willing to die for the promise I am making to you, Abraham, and your seed." It is an unconditional covenant with Abraham and his seed. All we have to do is accept it on faith. That's all. There's no way we could walk through the halves. Yahweh was the only one who passed between the halves. He unconditionally consented by oath to keep his promises to Abraham and his seed, being Israel, being us. Now you know that it's impossible for Yahweh to be killed. But even so, it was so serious to him that he did this. It was the strongest possible way for Yahweh to demonstrate it. Yahweh sees Israel through the blood of that covenant, through that thing that he did for Abraham so long ago. There is a mystery about the blood. In Leviticus 17:11 it says, Yahweh's talking about the blood sacrifices at this time in Leviticus 17. He says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood. I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your lives. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the life." It is the blood of the sacrifice. It's not the altar. It's not the priesthood performing the thing correctly. It's none of that. It's the blood of the sacrifice. And there is a mystery in that blood that we do not understand. Cain slew Abel, right? When he did, Yahweh says to him, "The voice of your brother's blood," Genesis 4:10, "the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me." But blood has a voice? But then in Genesis 9:4, "Do not eat the flesh with its life," the blood. The blood is the life of the flesh, of the animal? Is that it? Going back to Leviticus 17:11, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." There's something about the blood we're not fully understanding. There's a mystery there that we do not see. In Genesis 9:5, verse 5, it's basically saying that Yahweh says, "I'm going to require the blood from the murderer. If you kill somebody, I will require that blood." Let's let that sink in. For every death, even an animal's death, the blood will be required. For it's there. It's all about the blood. Now, I don't want to stretch this in one direction. I want to stay focused on where we are, on the covenantal thing. The life of the animal is in the blood. The life of the human is in the blood. So what happened when this took place? Yeshua died and bled for us. I kept hearing for so long, it's about the blood, it's about the blood. Well, I don't know what you're talking about. There's something in the blood that's the life, and Yeshua gave that blood, that life, of his own free will to get us sparkly clean. Shalom, y'all.